Everything's in my name. You get nothing, Grant said, sliding the divorce papers across the kitchen table with a smile. The same table where Camille had balanced his company's books for 19 years, and 3 weeks before he ever printed those pages, she'd already read every line of the money he thought he'd buried. Let me take you back. 6 months before that smile, Camille Dawson woke at 5 in the morning, the way she had for most of her 47 years. No alarm. Her body knew the hour. She rose in the dark of the brick rancher on Montvale Road, pulled on her robe, and in the closet, behind the stacked winter quilts, the plain shoebox sat where it always sat. She did not open it. She rarely did. It was the only thing in that house that belonged to her and her alone. And Grant, in all those years, had never once asked what was inside. He should have. By 5:20, the coffee was on. She stirred a little cinnamon into the grounds before they brewed, the way her father used to, and set the iron to warm for Grant's good shirt. The kitchen filled with the smell the whole house wore like a coat in those years. Cinnamon and hot starch and lemon polish. Clean. Kept. She had kept that house for 19 years, and she kept it well. Camille was a bookkeeper, had been since before the word felt old-fashioned. 5 mornings a week, she drove the 11 minutes to Foothills Family Clinic off Broadway, parked in the same spot under the same crepe myrtle, and made other people's mistakes disappear before anyone upstairs ever knew there'd been one. That Tuesday, a vendor invoice came in from the medical supply company. The total read $4,710. Camille read it once, set down her coffee, and read it again. The line items added to $4,170. Somebody had flipped 2 digits, the 7 and the 1, and built a $540 error that 3 sets of hands had passed along without blinking. She did not call a meeting. She did not type the word concern into an email. She drew one neat line through the wrong figure, wrote the right one above it, and put her initials in the margin. CD. Done in under a minute. How do you always catch those? The office manager asked her once, peering over her shoulder like it was a magic trick. Camille smiled and kept her pen moving. I don't raise my voice, she said. I reconcile. That was the whole of her, if you were paying attention. She did not argue with numbers. She sat with them until they told the truth, whether they wanted to or not. Give Camille Dawson a stack of statements and enough quiet, and sooner or later they confessed. At home, after supper, she kept a second set of books that nobody paid her to keep. Grant's Dawson Builds had started in 2006 as one truck and a borrowed cement mixer, and for 19 years Camille had been the reason its numbers ever balanced at the end of a month. She logged the invoices. She chased the clients who paid slow. She knew which subcontractors padded their hours by an honest hour, and which ones she could trust to a handshake in a gravel driveway. Grant swung the hammer and shook the hands and put his name on the little signs staked in front yards all over Blount County. Camille made sure there was money standing behind the name. He used to thank her for it. Early on, he'd come in smelling like sawdust and sweat and kiss the top of her head while she worked at the kitchen table, the good calculator clicking under her fingers. Somewhere in the last few years, the kisses stopped. The thank yous had stopped before that. She remembered the night she felt the change land for real. She'd found a billing mistake that would have cost him $11,000 on the Lambert job. Caught it, fixed it, told him over the meatloaf the way you'd mention rain coming. Grant didn't look up from his plate. You ever think, he said, you spend too much time worrying about my business? Camille set down her fork. It's our business, she said. It's got my name on it. He reached for the salt. That was all. He reached for the salt and the subject was closed, and she sat there a long moment with her hands folded in her lap, the way she'd been taught to sit in church when something inside her wanted to stand up. She said nothing. Camille was very good at noticing and saying nothing. Her father had been the same. Walter Foster spent 31 years pushing a broom and a buffer down the halls of Maryville Junior High. A custodian who could coax a dead boiler back to life at 6 in the morning and quote whole psalms from memory by 7. He never made much money in his life. He saved like a man who had decided somewhere far back that nobody on this earth was ever going to set him out in the cold with empty hands. By the dirt, not the house, baby girl, he told her, more times than she could count. They'd be sitting on the porch on Wilson Avenue, him with his coffee, the streetlight just coming on. A house can burn. A house can get took by the bank in an afternoon. But the dirt underneath it, the land that they cannot move and they cannot take, long as the right name is on the paper. You hear me? Always know whose name is on the paper. She'd half listened, the way children do with the kind of wisdom that turns out, years later, to matter most. She was a teenager. She wanted to talk about anything but dirt. Walter passed in the spring of 2011, quiet, in his sleep, 81 years old. There was a viewing at the funeral home on Cusick Street and a service at the church he'd swept for nothing on Saturdays, and half the county came through to say what kind of man he'd been. Afterward, Camille brought a few of his things home. Most of them she set out where she could see them, his Bible, the photo of him in his pressed work shirt. One thing she did not set out. One thing she folded into that plain shoebox and slid onto the closet shelf behind the quilts. And there it had stayed, year after year, while the dust gathered and the marriage cooled, and Grant never once thought to ask. The trouble, when it came, did not announce itself. It almost never does. It arrived the way water finds a crack, slow, and from underneath, in the small things a careful woman notices and a careless man forgets he's even doing. Grant started staying late at the office, the rented suite on Washington Street with Dawson build stenciled in gold on the glass. Late had never been his habit. Then there was the phone, a second one, cheap, black, the kind you buy with cash. He kept it face down on the counter and carried it into the garage to talk. He stopped letting Camille near the company mail, which she had opened and sorted for 19 years. Little things. She filed each one away in the quiet place where she kept everything. And then there was the drawer. The bottom drawer of Grant's office desk had been a junk drawer for as long as she'd known it. Dead pens, expired warranties, a tangle of phone chargers. That winter he put a lock on it. Not a cheap one. A real brass lock, the kind a man drives to the hardware store on Alcoa Highway and buys on purpose, and into the little label slot on the front, in his own blocky print, he'd slid a paper tab with 3 letters on it. TLC. Camille saw it on a Sunday, dropping off the lunch he'd forgotten. The office was empty. She stood in front of that desk longer than she meant to, the styrofoam container going cold in her hands, reading those 3 letters over and over. Tender, loving care, or initials, a woman's initials. She was 47 years old and she was nobody's fool, and a cold went through her that afternoon that she did not have a name for yet and did not want one. She did not ask him about it. She did not raise her voice in that empty office, or in the car, or at supper that night while he talked about a deck job in Friendsville and would not meet her eyes. That was not how Camille Dawson did anything. Instead, she did what her father had taught her, the thing she did better than anyone she'd ever met. She watched. She wrote things down, dates mostly, in the small spiral notebook she kept zipped in her purse, the same brand she used at the clinic. A cash withdrawal here, larger than the grocery run it was supposed to be. A night Grant came home at 11:30, smelling of lake water and gasoline instead of sawdust and pine. The Saturday, He said he was driving down to a job site in Venore, 40 minutes south, where the roads run out toward Tellico Lake, when Camille knew for a fact that Dawson Builds had no job in Venore. She kept the books. She had logged every contract the company signed that year. There was no job in Venore. She wrote that down too, in her small, neat hand, and underlined it once. She did not know yet what she was looking at. She only knew the numbers had begun to lie to her, here in her own kitchen, on her own clean table. And Camille Foster Dawson had spent her whole life teaching numbers, gently and without ever once raising her voice, that lying to her was the one thing they were not allowed to do. For 3 nights running, she stayed at the kitchen table after Grant went to bed, the good calculator at her elbow and a glass of milk going warm beside it. And she did what she had done for other people's money her whole working life. She reconciled. She still had access to the Dawson Builds operating account. She had set up the online login herself years back, on a Sunday afternoon, while Grant watched a ball game, and it had never once occurred to him to change the password, because in 19 years, it had never once occurred to him that he might need to. So Camille sat in the lamplight in her robe, and she pulled the statements, month by month, back through the fall and into the summer before it, and she began to lay the company's spending out across the table, the way you'd lay out a hand of cards you already knew was crooked. The pattern came up slow, the way a photograph used to come up in a tray. A withdrawal that did not match a payroll run. A check written to cash on a week with no subcontractors due. Money that left Dawson Builds and never came back as lumber. Never came back as concrete. Never came back as anything she could touch or count or stack against a job. She had logged every job. She knew where every nail in Blount County had gone. And here was money walking out the side door of her husband's company in the dark, a little at a time, patient, the way a man takes who has decided he has the right. Then she found the small thing. The small thing is always where they hang themselves. It was an auto pay. $31 and some odd cents every month, regular as a heartbeat, drafted out of the operating account to Fort Loudoun Electric, an electric cooperative. Camille knew the company's 2 real accounts cold, the office on Washington Street and the equipment yard out past the high school, and she paid both of those bills herself. This was a 3rd meter, a 3rd service address, drawing power month after month, 40 minutes from anywhere Dawson Builds had ever sunk a post. She wrote down the account number in her small spiral notebook. The next morning, on her break at the clinic, she sat in her car under the crepe myrtle and called the co-op's customer line. And she told the young man who answered that she was calling about the bill for her husband's property, and could he just confirm the service address she had on file, because she thought the office had it typed up wrong. He read it to her without a second's hesitation, a road number she had never heard of, in Venore, Tennessee, Monroe County. She thanked him. She always thanked them. Then she sat under the crepe myrtle with her hands folded on the steering wheel, and her heart going slow and even, and she did not cry, and she did not call Grant, and she did not do one single thing except memorize that address the way you memorize scripture, until it was hers. The Saturday after, Grant said he had a deck job down in Friendsville. He left a little after 7 with his thermos and his good boots, and Camille stood at the front window of the brick rancher on Montvale Road and watched the truck turn at the corner, and then she got her keys. She drove south, out of Maryville, down through the long green shoulders of US 411, where the strip malls give way to fence line, and the fence line gives way to ridge, the Smokies standing blue and patient off to her left the whole way down. She had her father's old gospel station turned low. She passed the turn for Venore proper and kept on, following the address the way you follow a number down a column, toward the place where the roads run out and the land goes soft and silver at the edges because the water has come up close to meet it. Tellico Lake. She had lived an hour from it her whole life and had maybe stood on its bank twice. The road number put her on a gravel lane that dropped down off the blacktop through a stand of cedar, and she came around the last bend slow, both hands on the wheel, and there it was. A cabin. New. So new the cedar siding still had that raw honey color it loses after a season, and the gravel of the drive hadn't yet packed down gray. It sat up on a gentle rise with the lake laid out flat and bright behind it, and there was a dock, a real dock, running out over the water on clean treated posts, and a porch that wrapped the lakeside, and big windows, the expensive kind, the kind Grant put in other people's houses and told Camille they couldn't afford for their own. Smoke would have looked right coming off that chimney. It was the prettiest thing she had ever seen, with her husband's hands all over it. She did not pull all the way in. She stopped the car at the mouth of the drive and she sat and she looked, and the thing she felt was not the thing she had driven down there braced to feel. She had come down that road, if she was honest with the steering wheel, half expecting to find a woman. The second phone had told her a woman. The lake water on his clothes had told her a woman. The 3 letters on the locked drawer had been telling her a woman for months. She had built a whole quiet grief around a woman and carried it down 411 in the passenger seat. And now she sat in front of the proof of it, and the woman was not the question anymore. The question was the cabin itself. Because Camille kept the books, and there was no money for this. Not in the company, not in their savings, not anywhere in the ledgered daylight life of Grant and Camille Dawson. A build like that was $250,000 before you hung a picture, and she would have seen $250,000 leave. She saw everything leave. So where, she thought, sitting at the end of that gravel drive with the lake throwing light up under her chin, where on God's earth did a drowning little contractor get the dirt and the dollars to set this down by the water and never tell his wife? She did not walk up to the windows. She did not need to. She turned the car around in the wide gravel mouth of the drive, slow and careful, and she drove the 40 minutes home. And the whole way back, the number she could not make balance sat in the seat beside her where the grief had been. The answer came to her 3 days later, out of a pair of his work pants. It was a Tuesday, laundry day, and she was going through his pockets at the washer the way she had gone through his pockets twice a week for 19 years, fishing out the receipts and the bent nails and the folded scraps of measurement before they went through the wash. And in the small watch pocket of his Carhartts, the little one most people never use, her fingers closed on a key. A small brass key, new, the cut still bright. She knew that key. She had been looking at the lock it belonged to since the winter. Grant was on a job. The house was quiet, just the washer filling behind her. Camille dried her hands on the dish towel, and she walked back to the little second bedroom they used as a home office, and she knelt down in front of his desk, and she fit the small brass key into the brass lock on the bottom drawer, and it turned like it had been waiting for her. Inside was a single manila folder, thick, and across the tab, in Grant's own blocky capital print, the same hand that had written those 3 letters on the front of the drawer. It did not say a woman's name. It said, plain as a road sign, Tellico Lake Cabin, TLC. Camille sat down on the floor of that little office with the folder open across her knees, and for a long while she did not move, because she was reading, and Camille Dawson read a thing all the way through before she let herself feel about it. It was a loan file, a construction line of credit, drawn against the company, $300,000. She turned the pages slow. She saw the draws, one after another, the money pulled down in chunks over a year and a half, and she could match every one of them now, in her head, to a withdrawal she had already laid out across her kitchen table at midnight. She saw the interest stacking up. She saw the payment schedule he had fallen behind on, 2 months, then 3. And she saw, near the back, the thing that turned her cold and still all the way down. The line was secured. Collateral. And the collateral was the cabin, described not by its pretty cedar and its dock, but the way the law describes a thing, by lot and by parcel, and by a legal description she copied, word for word, number for number, into her little spiral notebook in her small, steady hand, because that was what you did, you wrote it down. And sitting there, she finally understood that she had had her husband wrong from the start, and so had everyone. Grant Dawson was not getting rich behind her back. Grant Dawson was going under. The cabin was not a love nest, and the second phone was not a sweetheart. Or maybe it had been once, but that was the small sin sitting on top of the large one. The large one was that Dawson Builds was hollow. He had borrowed against a company her bookkeeping had kept alive, sunk the borrowed money into a house by the lake, fallen behind, and was now standing on the last dry patch of ground he had, with the bank's hand coming up out of the water toward his ankle. The 48 he had hidden, every dollar she would later learn he'd tucked away, was not a fortune he was keeping from her. It was the last dry money between Grant and the people he owed, and he meant to keep it dry by making sure that when the divorce came, the woman who knew exactly how to read those books walked out the door with nothing in her hands and nothing to say. That was the divorce. Not a man trading up, a man running, and he needed her gone, and quiet, and broke, before anybody thought to ask the woman who had kept the ledgers what the ledgers actually said. Camille closed the folder. She squared its edges against her knee, the way she squared every document, and she set it back in the drawer exactly as she had found it. And she turned the small brass key, and she stood up, and her knees popped, and the washer clicked over into its spin cycle down the hall like nothing in the world had changed. She did not raise her voice. There was no one to raise it to, and that was not how she did things anyway. She put the key back in the little watch pocket of his Carhartts, and she ran the wash, and she made supper, and when Grant came in smelling of sawdust and asked what was for dinner, she told him pork chops, and she meant it kindly, because a woman who has decided to reconcile a thing all the way to the bottom can afford to be kind while she does it. But late that night, with Grant snoring and the house gone dark and cold around her, Camille stood at the open door of their bedroom closet with the light off, looking up at the high shelf behind the stacked winter quilts, at the one plain shoebox that had sat up there untouched for 15 years. The only thing in that house that had ever been hers and hers alone, the thing Grant had never once asked about. There was a number in her notebook now, a lot and a parcel, copied off a bank's loan file. And there was a box on that shelf she had not opened since the spring her father went into the ground. And some quiet, certain part of Camille, the part that had been catching other people's buried mistakes her whole life, had begun to wonder whether those two things had been waiting all along to be laid down side by side. She reached up past the quilts, and she took the box down, and she carried it to the bed, and she sat with it on her knees in the dark. She did not open it right away. She sat with the weight of it across her knees, that old shoebox gone soft at the corners, the rubber band around it perished to a dry gray thread, and she rested her hand flat on the lid, the way you rest a hand on a Bible you mean to swear on. Walter Foster had been in the ground 15 years. Her father, a school custodian for 31 years, a man who had worn a ring of keys on his belt every working morning of his life, and had unlocked more doors for other people's children than any man she ever knew, and who had owned, at the end of it, one good gray suit, a paid-off Ford, and this box. She had carried it out of his little apartment the week after they buried him and set it up on the high shelf behind the winter quilts, and in 15 years she had not once taken it down, because some griefs do not want handling, and because some quiet part of her had always understood that whatever her daddy had folded away in that box was not a thing you opened on an ordinary night. You saved it. You waited until the water came up over your shoes, and then you reached. The water was over her shoes now, so she worked the gray thread of the rubber band loose, and it broke between her fingers like an old cobweb, and she lifted the lid in the dark and then reached over and clicked on the lamp, because some things you owe the dignity of looking at straight. On top, there were his glasses, the reading kind, the cheap drugstore kind he bought 3 pairs at a time, so there would always be a pair. Folded closed the way he used to fold them and set them on the arm of his chair. Underneath, photographs. Camille at 6 on a church step in a dress her mother had sewn. Camille at her high school graduation, Walter beside her in that same gray suit, both of them squinting into a Tennessee sun 29 years gone. And his keys. The whole heavy ring of them, the school keys he should have turned in his last day and somehow never did, and she lifted them out, and they were cold and heavy, and they smelled, faintly, impossibly, still of him, of floor wax and juicy fruit and the inside of that old Ford. And Camille Dawson, who did not cry, sat on the edge of her bed with her dead father's keys cupped in her 2 hands, and came nearer to it than she had come in 15 years. Under the keys, there was an envelope, thick, manila, the flap tucked and not glued, and across the front in soft pencil. In her father's hand, it said her name, not the name she carried now, the name she had carried before there ever was a Grant. Camille Foster. She turned it over and worked the flap free and slid the papers out into the lamplight, and there were 2 of them. One was a letter, 1 page, written close on both sides in pencil. The other was a legal document, several pages, folded in 3, with a blue-backed cover and an inked county stamp across the first page, the kind of stamp that means a thing has been carried down to a courthouse and handed across a counter and written into a book that does not get erased. She read the legal one first, because that was who she was, and because the letter frightened her, the way a letter from the dead will frighten the living, and she was not ready for it. So she unfolded the blue-backed document under the lamp, and she read it the way she read everything, all the way to the bottom before she let herself feel one thing about it. It was a deed of trust, drawn and recorded in the year 2009 in the office of the Register of Deeds of Monroe County, Tennessee. It conveyed 1 parcel of real property, described not by its trees or its water, but by lot and by parcel and by meets and by bounds, into something called the Foster Family Trust. And it named, as the sole beneficiary of that trust, the one living soul for whom that ground was to be held and kept, Camille Foster. She knew that legal description. She had copied it 3 nights before, word for word and number for number, off the front page of a bank's loan file, into the little spiral notebook lying that very moment on the nightstand a foot from her hand. She reached over and opened the notebook to the page, and she laid her own small, steady column of figures down beside the county's stamp, and she read the one against the other the way she had read 10,000 invoices against 10,000 checks across 19 years at that kitchen table. Lot for lot, parcel for parcel, the meats the same, the bounds the same, the dirt under Grant's cabin, the pretty cedar cabin with the dock and the wide lake windows he could not afford and had built in the dark with money he had skimmed out of a company his wife kept alive. It stood on a piece of ground that had been deeded recorded, and held in trust for Camille Foster since the year 2009, more than a decade before Grant Dawson ever drew the first dollar of that loan. Longer still before he poured the first bolt of that foundation. He had built his whole secret on her ground. He had pledged her ground to a bank as though it were his to pledge. And he did not know. He could not know, because the careful old man who recorded that deed had done it quietly, in his daughter's birth name, in a county 40 minutes from home, and had told no living person, and had folded the proof of it into a shoebox on a closet shelf and trusted his girl to reach for it when the water came up. Then she picked up the letter, and she read it in her father's voice, because 15 years gone or not, she could hear every word the way he would have said it, slow and a little gravelly and certain. "Camille girl," it said, "if you are reading this, then I have gone on home, and you have had a reason to go digging in this box. And I am sorry for the reason, because I believe I know what it is. You remember what I always told you. Buy the dirt, not the house. A house is sticks and paper and another man's labor, and it will burn or it will rot or the bank will come and haul the value of it off in a truck. But the dirt stays. Nobody can pick up the dirt and carry it off. You put your name on a piece of the ground, down at the courthouse where they write it in the book, and then whatever else this world takes from you, and it will take plenty, you have got yourself a place to stand. So I bought you some dirt. Back when the lake lots down in Monroe County were not worth a thing and a man who saved his quarters could afford one, I bought the prettiest piece of ground I ever stood on, down on the water at Tellico, and I did not put it in your name and mine, and I surely did not put it in your name and his. I put it in a trust, in the Foster name, the name you came into this world with, where no husband's debts, and no husband's lawyers, and no husband's bad year could ever reach it. I never spoke a word against the man you married, and I will not start now on paper. But I worked around men my whole life, Camille, cleaning up behind them, and I learned to tell the careful ones from the ones that are always one job away from rich. I watched him, and I wanted to be sure that whatever came, my girl would never have to stand in front of anybody and be told she had nothing. So I made sure. I made sure they could never set you out with empty hands. The dirt is yours, baby. It always was. Go on and stand on it. Daddy. Camille folded the letter back along the creases her father's own hands had pressed into it, and she sat a long while in the lamplight with the deed in one hand and the letter in the other, and she did not weep, though no soul on earth would have faulted her if she had. What she felt instead came down into her low and level and permanent, like water finding the one place in a foundation that is true. For 3 nights she had been carrying a number she could not make balance. A $250,000 cabin owned by a man who did not have $250,000. And now, at 1 in the morning, in her robe, on the edge of the bed where she had slept beside Grant Dawson for 19 years, the number balanced. It balanced perfectly. Grant had not built himself a cabin. Grant had built an improvement, with stolen money, on land that was already hers, and then he had pledged her land to a bank to cover a debt he could not pay. And then he had decided that the safest move left to him was to put his bookkeeper wife out of the house with nothing in her hands before she ever thought to read the books she had kept for 19 years. He had it precisely backward. He thought she was the thing he needed to be rid of. She was the only ground he had left to stand on, and she owned it down to the metes and the bounds. She put the deed and the letter back in the envelope, and the envelope back in the box. And the box she did not return to the high shelf. She set it in the bottom of her own closet, under her own coats, where her own hands could reach it. Then she switched off the lamp and lay down beside her husband in the dark and listened to him breathe. And she laid her plan the way she laid everything, line by line, in order. I don't raise my voice, she told herself, the way her father might have told her. I reconcile. In the morning, she did not go to war. She went to work, to the clinic, and on her break, she sat under the crepe myrtle and made 2 telephone calls. The first was to Dwight Halloran. Dwight Halloran kept an accounting office on Broadway in Maryville, a heavy-set, soft-spoken man near 70 who had been doing forensic work, the patient untangling of where money has really gone, since before anybody had a fancy word for it. Camille had sat across a table from him twice in her career, both times when the clinic was audited, and both times she had watched him find, gently and without ever once raising his voice, the exact place where somebody's numbers had gone crooked. She trusted him the way one careful person trusts another. She told him she had a matter, a personal one, and would rather bring it to him on paper than say it down a phone line, and Dwight Halloran, who had heard that sentence from 100 quiet women across 40 years, told her to come Thursday after she got off, and to bring everything. She brought everything. The statements she had pulled at midnight, the auto pay to Fort Loudoun Electric and the third service address out in Monroe County, the loan file out of the locked drawer, which she had photographed page by page on her phone one afternoon while Grant was framing a garage over in Seymour, then set back exactly as she had found it. And the deed. Dwight Halloran put on his own drugstore glasses and spread it all across his table, and for a long while, the only sound in that office was the soft riffle of pages and the man breathing, and Camille sat with her hands folded and let him work, because she of all people knew you do not rush a man while he is reconciling. It took him the better part of 2 weeks, on the side, between his real clients. When he called her back in, he had it laid out on a single sheet, the way the best of them always can. The whole crooked story walked down into one clean line a judge could follow. There had been a wire, he said. One wire, the big one, $480,000, moved out of accounts Grant Dawson controlled, run through a closing agent, and set down on the Teleco parcel, turned into cedar and glass and that long, clean dock. And alongside it, draw by draw, the bank's construction money, $300,000 of it, secured, Dwight said, tapping the loan file with one thick finger. Secured against the land, against this land, he said, and he laid his finger on the legal description in the loan file, and then he moved his hand 6 inches across the table and laid the same finger on the very same legal description in Walter Foster's recorded deed. He pledged this, Dwight Halloran said quietly, to get that, and it was never his to pledge. Camille. In 30 years of this, I have not seen one layout so clean. He borrowed against ground he did not own, and the ground belongs to you, and it has belonged to you on the record, down at that courthouse, since 2009. What does that mean? She asked him, though she already knew. She wanted to hear a certified public accountant say it out loud. It means the bank's lien is not worth the paper it is printed on, Dwight said. It means that the afternoon somebody official looks at this, and somebody will, that loan gets called and frozen the same day. And it means your husband does not have a fortune, Camille. He has a hole in the ground, and he is standing down in it. The second call she had made under the crepe myrtle was to Adrienne Cole. Adrienne Cole kept a law office in a converted house over on Cusick Street, a divorce lawyer in her 50s. Sharp as a tack and twice as quiet about it, a woman who had built a quarter-century practice on the plain principle that the loudest person in a divorce is almost never the one holding the winning card. Camille sat in her office on a Tuesday evening with the deed, and Dwight Halloran's one clean sheet of paper in a folder on her lap, and she told the whole of it, flat and in order, the way she would read off a trial balance. The second phone. The cabin she had never been told existed. The drawer marked in 3 letters she had been so afraid spelled a woman's name: the loan, the deed her father recorded in 2009. When she finished, Adrienne Cole sat very still a moment, then reached across the desk and asked, "May I?" And Camille handed her the folder, and Adrienne read the deed, and Camille watched a thing move across the lawyer's face that she would think about for a long time afterward. Adrienne read it once, the way you read anything. Then she read it again, slowly, the way you read a thing you cannot quite believe is real. And when she set it down, her hands were perfectly steady, but her voice had dropped low. "Camille," she said, "do you understand what this is?" "I keep the books," Camille said. "Yes, I understand exactly what it is." Then Adrienne Cole did the thing that let Camille know she had chosen right. She did not get excited. She did not talk about teaching anybody a lesson. She leaned back in her chair and looked up at the ceiling a moment, the way a careful person looks when they are thinking 3 moves down the board. And then she said, "Here is what we are not going to do. We are not going to call him. We are not going to call his lawyer and wave this in the air. We are not going to tip one single card. Men like your husband, Camille, when they believe they are winning, they cannot help themselves. They get bold. They put it in writing. They say it out loud in front of people. So we are going to let him." "Let him do what?" Camille asked. "Let him file," Adrienne said. "Let him stand up in open court, in front of a judge, in Blount County, and say that everything is in his name with his chest stuck out. And then, when he is good and finished saying it, we are going to open this folder." And so Camille Dawson, who could have laid her whole husband out flat across that kitchen table any night of the week, did the hardest thing a reconciler is ever asked to do. She waited. She made his supper. She kept his books right up to the end, balancing the dwindling accounts of a company she now knew was hollow, initialing the margins, catching, 3 days before the end, a transposed figure in a lumber invoice, 1800 read as 801, and fixing it without a word out of pure 30-year habit, because that was who she was, even on her way out the door. And she let her husband believe every single day that he was getting clean away. 3 weeks after the night she opened her father's box, Grant printed his pages. He did it the way she had known he would, at the kitchen table, on a weekday evening, with the cinnamon and the starch still hanging in the warm air from supper. He had a lawyer's envelope and a careful little stack of paper and a pen he set down squarely on top of it, and he had practiced, she could tell he had practiced, the easy, gentlemanly way he pulled out her own chair for her. And then Grant Dawson slid the divorce papers across the same table where she had balanced his company's books for 19 years. And he smiled at her, the warm old smile she had married, and he said the words he had no doubt been rehearsing alone in his truck for weeks. "Everything's in my name, Camille. The house, the company, the lot, all of it. You get nothing." And Camille Foster Dawson looked at the man, and she did not raise her voice, because she never did, and because there was nothing left in her to say to him that a courtroom could not say a great deal better in 3 weeks' time. She picked up his pen. She read every line, the way she read all things, all the way to the bottom, and where the paper told her to sign, she signed, "Camille Foster Dawson," in her small, steady hand, calm as a Sunday morning. She slid the papers back across the table. She told him the pork chops were in the icebox if he got hungry later. Then she walked back to the bedroom and she packed one suitcase, just the one, the way he had told her she would leave, and on top of her folded clothes she laid one old shoebox gone soft at the corners, and she carried it out to her car with her own 2 hands. He watched her go from the front window of the brick rancher on Montvale Road, and he was still smiling. He believed he had won. He believed the dangerous part was behind him. The dangerous part was a courthouse 3 weeks down the road, and she was driving toward it with her father's dirt deeded under her own name and a folder riding on the seat beside her, and she did not raise her voice the whole way there. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning at the Blount County Courthouse downtown, the old one with the white columns. Adrienne Cole asked for nothing in the filings that would make Grant or his lawyer look at the matter twice. No motions, no demands, only a wife asking, meekly and on paper, for the court's time to finalize what her husband had already drawn up himself. As far as Grant Dawson knew, he was driving downtown that morning to watch his bookkeeper wife sign herself the rest of the way out of his life with nothing in her hands. Camille got there early. She always got everywhere early. She sat in her car in the lot off Court Street with the folder closed on her lap, Dwight Halloran's one clean sheet on top, her father's recorded deed beneath it, and the letter written in pencil, folded small in the inside pocket of her good coat, over her heart where she had decided it would ride. She watched Grant's truck swing into the lot across the way. She watched him climb out in a sport coat she had never once seen, and laugh at something his lawyer said, and roll his shoulders back, and start up the courthouse steps between those white columns like a man walking up to collect. Camille sat one more quiet minute in her car. Then she lifted the folder off her lap, and she opened her door, and she followed him in. Inside, the building was cool and dim after the glare of the parking lot, and Camille's low heels told quietly on the marble as she climbed the worn stairs to the second floor, where the courtroom sat behind tall doors of frosted glass. The room they had drawn was high-ceilinged and plain, with long windows that let the June light fall in bars across the old pews, and it smelled of floor wax and dust and the cool, settled breath of a place that had been keeping other people's trouble since before she was born. She took the chair at the table on the left, where Adrienne Cole had told her she would sit, and she laid the folder square in front of her, closed, and folded her hands upon it, and waited. Across the aisle, Grant settled in beside his lawyer, a young man in a gray suit named Pruitt, who had a soft leather folder and a legal pad with nothing yet written on it. Grant leaned and murmured something behind his hand, and the two of them shared a small, private laugh, the easy laugh of men who have already counted the money on the table and have only to sit until somebody slides it across to them. He did not look at Camille. He had stopped looking at her some weeks back, the way a man stops looking at a chair he means to carry out to the curb. Judge Calloway came in a little after 9, a spare, gray-haired woman who had sat the Blount County bench so long she wore its patience like her robe. And the room stood, and the room sat, and she settled her glasses on her nose and opened the file before her with the air of a person expecting nothing in it she had not seen 1,000 times. "Uncontested," she said, half to herself. "The parties have reached an agreement." Mr. Pruitt rose and said, "Yes, Your Honor." A full and amicable settlement, that his client had provided for an orderly division of the marital property, and that Mrs. Dawson had reviewed and signed every page, and he lifted the stapled papers a little, the way you lift a thing that has already won. The judge nodded and turned to Camille and asked her, the way the law makes them ask, whether she had signed of her own free will, and whether she understood that by signing she gave up her claims. Camille stood. Her hands were steady at her sides. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I read it all the way to the bottom. I signed it in my own hand." And she sat back down, and across the aisle, Grant let the smile come up onto his face and stay there, because to his ear that had sounded just exactly like a woman lying down in the road. Then Adrienne Cole rose, unhurried, and buttoned the one button of her jacket. "Your Honor," she said, "before the court finalizes any division of real property, counsel would ask a moment's leave. The settlement before you divides, among other things, a lakefront parcel down in Monroe County, the one improved with a cabin. The petitioner has represented that property as his to give. Before the court signs an order resting on that representation, I would like to enter a single recorded instrument so that the court divides only what there is, in fact, to divide. Mr. Pruitt half rose, his brow knit. "Your Honor, we have no objection," he said, "though I confess I don't see." And the judge said over him mildly, "Let's have a look, counsel. Bring it up." And Adrienne Cole opened Camille's folder. It was the very paperwork Grant had been so certain no living soul would read, and she had read every page of it weeks before he ever printed the first one. Adrienne drew out a single sheet, a certified copy with the Register of Deeds stamp inked blue in the corner, and she handed one copy to Pruitt and carried the original up to the clerk. And then, in a flat and unhurried voice that did not rise at any word, she read one clause out of the body of it. "The grantor, Walter Foster," the deed said, "does hereby grant, convey, and confirm the parcel described herein unto the Foster Family Trust, to be held for the sole and separate benefit of his daughter, Camille Foster, her heirs and assigns, forever." "Recorded," Adrienne said, lowering the page, "in the office of the Monroe County Register of Deeds in the spring of 2009. She let it sit one moment in the waxed and watching quiet. "That parcel, Your Honor, is the ground the cabin stands on. It was placed in my client's trust by her late father 17 years ago, and it has never, for one single day, belonged to the petitioner. He cannot divide it in this settlement, and he cannot hand it back to her as though it were his to withhold, because it was never his at all. It is hers. It has been hers the entire time he has been building on it." The smile was still on Grant's face, but it had stopped meaning anything, the way a clock keeps a face after it has quit. And while Pruitt was still turning the deed over in his hands as if the back of the page might tell a different story than the front, Adrienne laid a second sheet down beside the first, and this one she barely had to read at all. "My client retained a certified public accountant in Maryville, Mr. Dwight Halloran, to trace the money that built that cabin," she said. "He found one wire, $480,000, moved out of accounts the petitioner controlled, that paid for the cedar and the glass and the dock. And he found a construction loan, $300,000 from Foothills Bank and Trust, that the petitioner drew down to the last dollar and pledged to the bank as secured. Secured, Your Honor, against this same Monroe County parcel, pledged against my client's land." She paused, and something almost soft came into her voice, almost kind. "The petitioner kept that loan in a file in his office," she said, marked in his own hand in 3 letters. TLC. My client passed a good many sleepless nights fearing those letters spelled another woman's name. They did not. They stood for the Tellico Lake cabin. They stood for the one debt in all the world that could pull him under, a debt he secured against ground he did not own and could not pledge. And the afternoon this court takes notice of that deed, Your Honor, the bank's lien is worth no more than the ink it was written in. The room had gone very still. Somewhere down on the street, a truck shifted gears and was gone. Judge Calloway took off her glasses. She looked a long moment at the certified deed lying in front of her, the blue stamp, the careful old language, and then she lifted her eyes and looked across the aisle at Grant Dawson, who had walked up the courthouse steps an hour before in a sport coat his wife had never seen, laughing, certain. The smile was the last part of him to learn what had happened. It went out of his face the slow way the light leaves a window at dusk, and what stood behind it was a man with empty hands and no ground under them, and nothing left to say that anyone in that room would believe. The judge set down her pen. She did not sign the settlement that morning. A property division could not stand, she said, on land the petitioner did not own, nor on collateral he had no right to pledge, and she continued the matter and referred the question of the construction loan, in plain words, for a closer look than this courtroom was the place to give it. What came after came quickly, and it came on paper. Within the week, a lawyer for Foothills Bank and Trust put on notice of a deed in the Foster name, called the construction loan, and froze what was left of the account, pending a review of how the bank's money had come to rest on ground that secured nothing at all. Dawson Builds, with its credit line cut and its one real asset standing on another person's land, missed a payroll, then a lumber bill, then the note itself, and went under. On a Tuesday, a man Camille had never met taped a notice to the glass door of the Dawson Builds office. And a few days after that, the lettering that spelled the company name came off the door of the white work truck in long curls under a razor blade. And the man who scraped it away did not know whose name it had been. Camille closed the company's books herself, one last time, the week the bank moved. She ruled a single line under the final figure in her small, even hand, the way her father had once ruled a line under a swept and finished floor. And she did not initial the margin, and she did not make it balance, because it was not hers to balance anymore. She drove out to the water on a morning when the divorce was finally, quietly done, 40 minutes down through Monroe County with the windows cracked and the letter folded in the pocket of her coat. The cabin stood where she had first seen it, cedar and glass above the lake, only now the deed down at the courthouse and the deed in her closet said the same name, and the name was hers. At first light, she stood at the rail above the water at Tellico. The letter lay folded in her coat pocket, and she watched the lake turn from gray to gold.